Though he couldn't see much in the dark room, since the neon lights did little to illuminate anything, he could at least see the figures moving amongst each other. The bouncer wasn't kidding. It was packed in here. Then, Stephen realized he had already lost Dave in the constantly shifting bodies. So the young man, who felt out of place, stared up at the dancer until he quickly grew bored. Then he traversed the maze of bodies until he pushed into a spot at the bar. "What's your poison?" the bartender asked. She was cute enough. "Rum and coke, please," he replied, and his drink was ready in a few brief moments. Just as he took the first sip, Dave reappeared next to him at the bar. "So, have you finally gotten a woman yet, or what?" Dave asked, as they struggled to hold their place at the bar. "No, not yet, but there's a girl I've been looking at," Stephen replied. They both downed about half their drinks before continuing the conversation. "Oh yeah, who is she? Have I met her already?" Dave inevitably asked. "Actually," Stephen began before finishing his drink completely, "actually, she's my neighbor across the street." Dave's eyes suddenly narrowed, and he put his drink down beside him as he stared at Stephen. His face had a suggestion of confusion, as if wondering like this was a joke. "That woman in the blue house right across from you?" "Yeah, what? She's gorgeous," Stephen said with some defense. He should have known this would come from Dave. His friend was much fonder of younger women, such as women who had just gotten their high school diploma. Dave stared at Stephen for a bit longer as his confusion turned to concern. Then, he finally broke his gaze as he realized his friend could feel the judgment. He didn't say anything more, just picked his drink back up and shook his head in disbelief. "What?" Stephen asked adamantly. "What's wrong with her?" Dave shook his head again and filled his response with sarcasm. "Nothing. I just didn't think you got all hot and heavy over fossils." Stephen was appalled. "She's barely older than me." Dave looked to his friend with the same concern before staring into his drink again. "Whatever you say, man." He glanced back at Stephen, who seemed a bit downed by his ridicule. Dave sighed and attempted to lighten the mood. "Well, I guess older gals are at least experienced." It seemed to work. Stephen worked up a small smirk. The two friends ordered more drinks and stayed for a while to watch the entertainers. Dave even bought Steve a lap dance, to see if a younger woman's touch would bring his friend back from his strange little fantasy. It didn't work. Halfway through, Stephen walked out of the private room looking a bit shaken and couldn't stop his endlessly babbling about his neighbor. Soon, Dave became sick of it and a little creeped out. So, he ended the night early and took his friend back home. The week went on and the burdens continued. One can only count down the days until Friday came, and they can indulge in their personal activities for the next few days. Most people would go out with their friends to a bar on Friday night, then spend the next morning sleeping off the migraines and aches in their bodies before continuing their self-annihilation that evening. Others would spend their few precious days with their families. However, the young man across the street from the blue house sat idly and peered out his window. He would occasionally get up and grab something to eat if his stomach was vocal enough, or visit the bathroom regularly. Other than that, he just watched his neighbor's front door and waited for the slightest hint of movement. He let out a gasp as the door swung open. With his nose touching the glass, he watched the woman step out. Her hair was more enchanting than ever, and her lustrous eyes glimmered in the gentle morning light. Again, his eyes wandered down along her curves that were being hugged by a pair of tight jeans and a black t-shirt. He needed to go meet her. He had to talk to her. He reached over and snatched his coat while opening the door. His heart started to race as her eyes came up to meet his. What would he say? What could he say? His mind was a garbled mess, and his hands trembled like leaves in a harsh wind. He stuffed them into the pockets of his coat so she wouldn't see his anxiety ripping him apart. However, the twitches and clouds fogging his mind only became worse as he descended the steps of his own porch. Those eyes, those massive eyes gazed upon him. He worked a friendly smile on his lips that nearly made him collapse. He was now crossing the street, and she just stood there, waiting for him, like she had been expecting this for a while. Even as he made it onto her property, his words blended together in the back of his throat, and legs were too numb to keep a steady pace. She was so close now. He stopped a few feet in front of her. He could feel the beads of sweat forming on his scalp and threatening to pour down his face. She just kept starting at him. He needed to speak fast before she deduced that he was just some creep. Any words, anything. Suddenly, she smiled. Her lips turned up into a warm, welcoming smile, and her eyes matched the same gesture. "Stephen, right?" she asked with the voice of a songbird. His heart climbed into his throat, which made his limits of speech even worse. Luckily, he got at least one word out, "Hi." His voice was shaky and far less elegant than the woman's. She let out a gentle laugh. "My name's Hera." Stephen would either remember that forever or forget it in the next 5 seconds. She stuck out her hand in a polite gesture. He didn't want to take it, as his own hands were like furnaces in his pockets and filling them with sweat. Nevertheless, he brought his right out and shook her hand, hoping that the time it took in the open air to reach her hand would have been enough to dry it out a bit. "What's the reason for the special visit today, dear?" Her voice rang through his head like a comforting symphony. "I just wanted to finally meet you. We've been neighbors for about 2 months, he said, trying his best to sound normal. "Ah, well, why don't you come inside? I just baked a fresh tray of cookies and I can't eat them all on my own," she invited. He couldn't believe it. His nerves were already shot and his voice felt sore, but he managed to force out another sentence. "I'd love to." She moved around him to pick up the paper and led him back to the house. "Oh, please take off your shoes before coming in, dear," she instructed, and Stephen obeyed without question. He stepped into the dimly lit home, and immediately a strange smell hit his nose. It was musky and slightly sour, yet it felt welcoming, like a safe place to be pampered with food and praised endlessly. His focus drifted back to the realization that he was inside Hera's home. It looked much like his own, in a structural sense, but the furniture was much different. The living room had 2 reclining chairs that looked comfortable enough to sleep on, and the couch seemed like you could sink straight through the earth. A couple of old paintings hung on the walls, and a quaint bookshelf stood in the corner that held a variety of cookbooks. Stephen soaked it all in for a moment, before remembering why he was here. He followed Hera into the small kitchen where a tray of chocolate chip cookies sat on top of the oven. Steam was still rising from them, and the chips were still glossy as they continued to melt. His mouth watered. "Go right ahead, dear. Take as many as you like," Hera said. So he did. They tasted amazing, still slightly gooey on the inside. Before she could even converse with him further, he had already gotten down 3 of the treats. "So, what do you do for a living, Stephen?" she asked as the 4th went into his stomach. "Accountant at the bank just in town," he said between bites. "Oh, how fun. You work from home, don't you?" Stephen shook his head slightly, which started to feel a bit strange. "No, ma'am. They still have me coming into the office even though I've requested to stay home." He began to feel drowsy. Maybe all this excitement had worn him down already. He picked up the 6th cookie and only consumed half of it as his breathing began to slow. She nodded while staring at him with that bright smile. "So you can watch me more, right?" His eyes widened, his legs quickly became numb, and the tips of his fingers tingled. "Yes, dear. I've seen you by your little window, gazing at me like a child staring at a toy through the shop window." His eyes became heavy. Each time he shut his eyes to blink, it felt like an eternity before they opened again. His tongue refused to rise from the bottom of his mouth to respond. He slowly sunk to the floor as her gaze turned to a glare. "I've been waiting for you to come up to me for a long time now. You've made me wait for a while." His eyes clamped shut and stayed. His body shut down. The last thing he felt was her cold, wrinkled hand caressing his cheek. A few hours passed, perhaps a few days. Time was more of an illusion during his slumber, more so than when he was awake. Stephen would long for that Saturday morning, that next Saturday morning when he could see her again. The rest of the days just blended together into a monotonous routine. Though down here, where the walls were coated in a thin moisture and one could smell the tiny pores of mold, the conception of time was fleeting. He only stared at the ceiling and breathed slowly as his body trembled from the cold. It was dark down here. He could barely see the trusses holding the house above him. Eventually, his sight adjusted to the lack of light and could see in a bit more detail. There's others down here just like him, other unwary souls who grew attached to a stunning creature. Stephen stared at each one for some time as they hung above him from the trusses. It looked like they were floating above him, all completely still and occasionally spinning in their own directions, their mouths hung open and their eyes missing. Stephen's body shook again as he stared up at them. Their bodies were a sickly grey, and some looked as though they had lost some of their mass. Every so often Stephen gagged as the stench stung his throat again. He struggled desperately not to lose the nothing in his stomach, because he couldn't turn over on this table. He could only lie there and wonder what would become of him. Though it wasn't long before a soft clicking noise filled the otherwise silent and eerie basement. Stephen swung his head to the door adjacent to him. It opened slowly and was accompanied by a creaking whine. There she was, the hunched-over, frail old woman he had stared at for so long, her dry, wrinkly skin hanging off her bones and her grey, stringy hair woven in tightly knotted clumps. The door closed with a soft click, and she turned to stare back at him with her nearly white eyes. He gazed into the veins running into her faded pupils and her wide smile that boasted only a few blackened teeth. He found himself pulling on the chains out of pure instinct while she approached him. Her joints popped, and her teeth clattered together as black drool seeped from her lips. He desperately struggled for freedom, but the bindings kept his body so stretched that cramps set in, and he cried out in pain. "Shh," she said with an intended soothing tone, but her voice was too sharp and raspingly. "You've been wanting this for a long time, dear." Dark drops of spittle landed on his chest as she spoke. He gagged once, but the notion was gone as she came to his side. She reached her long, grotesque fingers out and glided her decaying nails along his bare stomach. He trembled in disgust and fear. What are you?" he stuttered out as the nails came up to his neck. "I'm your darling neighbor," she responded. She leaned down slowly and he watched her, his eyes wide and his mouth agape as he watched that long black tongue slide out from between her cracked lips. The drool dripped from the tip and landed on his stomach before pooling into his belly button. He screamed as the icy tongue pressed against his stomach and slid around in circles. The slimy saliva coated his smooth skin and burned him. His screams turned to screeches as he felt the teeth next. They dug into his flesh and ripped out hearty chunks with each bite. He cried and writhed and struggled. The cold air touching his insides was maddening, and soon they too were ripped away.